Welcome. Is OpenAI's claim that Australia's economy could be more than $100 billion better off within 5 years realistic?
It's possible, but economists vary wildly in their predictions of how much AI will add to our economy. There's no one-handed economist, as they say. On the one hand, they say it could be just a tiny, tiny productivity gain or economic gain, and then on the other hand, they say, well, there could be a massive gain. So it really remains to be seen, and how we adopt AI will really matter.
The Assistant Minister for Technology, Andrew Charlton, said today he's very interested in the productivity dividend from AI, specifically what it will be, where we will see it, and when it will arrive. What are your thoughts?
I think that the key thing has to be how we adopt AI at scale. For the first sort of decade of this century, AI was primarily in the laboratory. It's only in the last decade that we saw it sort of leap out of the laboratory and into the real world. And now in the last few years, we're starting to see companies and governments move at scale and do things at a much bigger level. And that's where I think we'll start to see the economic effects. And let's be really honest about it. Those economic effects could be startlingly positive or negative. And the questions about how we actually get a better future will depend on things like the skills transformation that we have, how we engage workers in the technological transformation that is happening all around them, but also how we make sure that the guardrails are fit and appropriate for what we need.
Is the greatest driver of any productivity from AI going to result from an inevitable loss of jobs?
I do think that some jobs will disappear and some jobs will become even more sought after. And so it's very easy for us to kind of take a 20,000 foot view and say, well, yes, but over the next decade or two, those two things might even out, because for many people that transition could be achingly difficult. And we've seen in previous massive industrial transformations that some people lose their job and never get a job again. So what we really need to look at now is a kind of a just transition when it comes to AI, where workers are supported as their jobs might change around them.
If productivity gains come as a result of mass layoffs around the same time, could there be negative consequences as a whole for society and Australia's economy?
Yeah, generally when we see an increase in productivity, that's good for the economy and it's good for our community, but it's not always true. As you point out, you can have a very significant gain in productivity simply by wiping out a whole bunch of jobs and automating those jobs out of existence. Now that may look good in terms of the productivity statistics, but of course the net public benefit just won't be there, right? It'll be a massive social downside that we'll all have to cope with for potentially generations. So that's where we have to be really careful. Productivity is a great measure, but we need to aim for the sort of good productivity where we take workers on the journey and we make sure that people aren't harmed along the way.
How soon could those new jobs we keep hearing about and new markets actually arrive in Australia?
Very difficult. I mean, we're seeing lots of prognostications, but what we are seeing is that there are some forward-looking companies and indeed forward-looking governments that are already starting to make big moves here. So Telstra has been on the record publicly as saying that they see a significant decrease in employment as a result of their move towards AI and automation. So there's no question that that's happening around us. But precisely how quickly that happens, and I think the more interesting question is precisely what are the social consequences? They're really the result of the decisions we make right now.
Does the fear of AI, the fear of job losses, explain to some extent why Australia, usually an early adopter of technology, hasn't been in this instance?
Among developed countries, Australians are really probably the least trusting of AI. And there are a few reasons for that. I think one of them is absolutely, I think, a concern about job losses, but I don't think it's the main concern. I think people have been worried about what they've seen when automated systems go wrong. So Robodebt is perhaps the most infamous example of that. And so I think in 2025 we need to ask a really important question, which is, are there ways of leaning into artificial intelligence that will give us really good benefits in terms of our economy and productivity, but can also address those risks that people, I think, are rightly concerned about? If we simply adopt this approach where we just kind of wave our arms around and say how wonderful AI is and we ignore the risks, I don't think that will actually increase the trust that Australians have in AI. I think what we need to do is we need to speak honestly and openly with the Australian community about what the opportunities are. And we also need to be just as open about what the risks are and, most importantly, what we're doing about those risks to make sure that they're not going to cause widespread harm.
Is this a conversation you expect the government is going to ramp up in the lead up to the roundtable on economic reform and productivity in August?
I think certainly over the course of this year, the government has signalled that it wants to find new ways of leaning into AI. And I think what the Minister and the Assistant Minister, Tim Ayres and Andrew Charlton, have said publicly is that we should kind of innovate where we can and regulate where we must. And I think that is exactly the right balance. It's easier to say, and so the hard work is how do we actually bring that vision to life? Because I think that's what will make a really big difference in the Australian community, increasing its trust in AI in a sustainable way.
OpenAI says the government should be offering tax incentives to business to adopt it sooner rather than later. Do you think that's sound advice?
Look, I mean, I think OpenAI is acting in its own commercial interests in looking to minimise its tax exposure in Australia, and so you'd expect them to do that. I think the question from a public interest perspective is what will be the public benefit in doing that? If it's purely speculative gains in terms of productivity, greater efficiency, better government services, then it won't stack up. If, by contrast, we can see how there will be really significant positive benefits and that they do stack up, then essentially what they're asking for is a form of investment from government. And that investment could easily stack up, but we need to see the detailed work. We can't just have sort of airy statements that there is the potential for productivity gains. Clearly that's true, but there's also the potential for bad productivity gains, and there's also the potential for no productivity gains at all.
Edward Santow, good to speak to you.
Thank you.